Lily walked into the cafe, the soft chime of the doorbell barely noticed by anyone inside. She always felt like that, like she was just a shadow, a passing breeze that no one took the time to notice. The cafe was a cozy little place tucked on the corner of a busy street, a spot most people passed by without a second thought. It was always full during lunch and dinner hours, the buzz of chatter and clinking cups filling the air. But even though the cafe was always busy, Lily never felt like she was truly seen. She was the type of person who blended into the background, never one to stand out in a crowd. Her uniform, black pants, a simple white shirt, and an apron, didn't help her stand apart. She moved quickly between the tables, taking orders and refilling drinks, always careful to keep her head down. She'd learned long ago that it was easier to stay unnoticed. That way, she didn't have to face the uncomfortable feeling of being judged, ignored, or worse, treated like she didn't matter. Her life wasn't much different from the people who came to the cafe. She was just one of many trying to make a living, trying to get by. But Lily had always had dreams, big dreams, dreams that seemed so far away now. When she was younger, she used to imagine a life filled with music, playing the piano on grand stages, feeling the thrill of each note she played, surrounded by an audience that appreciated her talent. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had faded. They slipped into the background, buried under the weight of daily life and the struggle to survive. Money had always been tight growing up. There was never enough for piano lessons, let alone the kind of music education that could turn her passion into a career. Instead of pursuing what she loved, Lily had settled for jobs that paid the bills, first as a cashier, then as a waitress. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for a long time that was enough. The cafe, though, was different. The work was hard and the hours were long, but it was more than just a job to Lily. It was a place where she could get lost in the rhythm of the day, where her mind could wander while she moved from table to table. She had grown to appreciate the little moments of peace, like the early mornings when she arrived before the rush. The cafe was quiet then, with just the sound of the coffee brewing and the occasional creak of the old wood floors beneath her feet. It was the only time of day when she felt like she could breathe, but as soon as the first customer walked through the door, that calm was gone. The cafe was full, always full, with people who barely glanced at her, much less looked her in the eye. Most of the customers didn't even notice her, unless their coffee was too cold or their food was too late. And when they did look at her, it was usually with impatience or irritation, like she was just another part of the background they had to deal with. Then there were the regulars, a group of men who always sat at the same corner table. They were businessmen, well-dressed with expensive suits and watches that caught the light. They came in every day, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and a croissant. They barely ever spoke to her. Instead, they would mutter to each other, their conversations always loud and punctuated with laughter, but not the kind of laughter that made anyone else smile. No, their laughter was the kind that made you feel small, like you were invisible. Lily knew them well enough by now to recognize their faces, but she wasn't sure if they even knew hers. They never bothered to make small talk with her or ask how her day was going. In fact, it seemed like they went out of their way to avoid eye contact, as if acknowledging her would somehow make her more real, more human. Instead, she just refilled their coffee cups, took their orders, and disappeared as quickly as she'd appeared. But even though they treated her like she was nothing, Lily had learned to keep her head high and her smile polite. She knew what it was like to be ignored, to be overlooked. She'd been living that way for as long as she could remember. But what hurt wasn't that they didn't see her. It was that she had grown used to it. Somewhere deep down, she had accepted that this was her place in the world, that she wasn't meant to be anything more than a waitress at a small cafe. Still, every so often her mind would wander back to those days when music was her escape. She remembered the sound of the piano keys, the way her fingers would glide over them effortlessly, creating melodies that felt like they came straight from her soul. But those days seemed so far away now. No one knew about her piano playing. No one knew that she had once dreamed of being a musician. That dream felt like a distant memory, locked away in the back of her mind, a part of her life that didn't matter anymore. As the days passed, Lily's routine became more and more automatic. Wake up, go to work, take orders, refill cups, repeat. There was little room for anything else, and when she did have a rare moment of free time, she was too tired to do much more than collapse onto her couch at home, Music had become a forgotten dream, something she no longer had the energy to chase, and honestly, she wasn't sure she had the courage to even try anymore. Her coworkers noticed her quiet nature, but they didn't mind. They were all in the same boat, working long hours for little pay. There wasn't much room for deep conversation in a job like this. Most of the time, they kept to themselves, caught up in their own lives and problems. Every now and then, someone would joke with her, but those moments were few and far between. Most of the time, Lily was just the invisible waitress, someone to take the orders, bring the food, and disappear before the next round of customers came in. Yet, through it all, there was something inside Lily that refused to give up. Maybe it was a flicker of hope. Maybe it was a stubborn streak of determination. Whatever it was, she kept going. She didn't know why, but something inside her still believed that there had to be more to life than this. Maybe one day someone would see her for more than just a waitress. Maybe one day she would find a way to bring that old dream of playing the piano back to life. But for now, she just kept moving through the days, one coffee refill at a time, hoping that something somehow would change. The cafe had its own rhythm, a flow that seemed to exist outside of time. Every day, Lily arrived early, before the sun had fully risen, and started preparing for the rush of customers that would come. There was something calming about these early hours. It was a time when she could move through the space quietly, without the usual chatter or demands. She would wipe down the tables, polish the glasses, and fill the sugar jars, each task becoming a small ritual that grounded her. The cafe itself was a little worn around the edges, its charm coming not from its polished appearance but from its warmth. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the small windows let in just enough light to give the place a soft, golden glow during the day. The walls were lined with old photos, some faded, others still sharp with detail, telling stories of a time before the modern hustle had taken over. It was the kind of place where people came not just for the coffee, but for the comfort of knowing they could sit for hours without being rushed. The regulars were what kept the place alive. Some came in every day, others just a few times a week, but all of them had their habits. There were the old men who always ordered black coffee and sat by the window to read the newspaper. There was the young couple who came in every Friday evening for a quiet dinner, their soft-spoken conversations barely louder than the hum of the cafe's old refrigerator. But it was the businessmen who were the most prominent and the most difficult to ignore. They sat at the corner table, as they always did, right next to the large windows that gave them a view of the street outside. They were well-dressed, always in suits, their expensive shoes clicking on the floor as they walked in. There was always one or two of them, but often more would join throughout the day. They seemed to have their own little world where the noise of the cafe didn't reach them. They never spoke to Lily directly, not unless they needed something, a refill on their coffee or a menu when it was time to order. And when they did speak, it was often in a tone that made her feel like she was just a servant, a part of the background that didn't really matter. Lily had learned to ignore them, to carry on with her work as if they didn't exist. It was easier that way. If she paid too much attention to them, she might feel the sting of their dismissive glances, the way they acted like she wasn't even worth acknowledging. Sometimes she would overhear their conversations, business deals, investment talks, the sort of things that seemed so far out of her reach. They talked in a way that made it clear they were successful, that they had everything figured out. And Lily couldn't help but wonder how they could be so confident, so sure of themselves, while she felt like she was still just trying to find her footing. But there was one thing about them that always bothered her. They had a tendency to make jokes at the expense of the waitstaff, talking about the jobs they didn't think anyone would want. They were never outright rude, but there was always an undercurrent of superiority, like they were above the very people who served them. It made Lily uncomfortable, but she said nothing. She'd learned long ago not to rock the boat. She just smiled and carried on, pretending she didn't hear the cutting remarks, pretending they didn't bother her. But deep down they did. As the days went on, Lily's routine never really changed. She would serve the regulars, take the orders, and occasionally chat with the other waitstaff when they weren't too busy. The hours were long, but there was a rhythm to it, and in some strange way, she had come to accept it. The monotony of it all became like a second skin, something she just wore without thinking. Most of her coworkers didn't have much to say to her. They weren't unfriendly, but they were caught up in their own lives. The cafe wasn't the kind of place where anyone formed close bonds. Everyone had their own stories, their own struggles, and most of them were just here to make ends meet. It wasn't like she had anything in common with them anyway. They were all too focused on their own problems, and Lily didn't have the energy to dive into anyone else's. But there was one moment, one small moment, when something unexpected happened. A few weeks into her routine, as Lily was serving a table near the front, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. The businessmen had come in as usual, but this time they seemed different. They weren't as loud as usual, and there was something about the way they were sitting that made her feel uneasy. They weren't laughing at their usual jokes or discussing the latest stock market trends. Instead, they seemed focused, almost distant. Lily couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. It wasn't the same as the usual atmosphere. For a moment, she felt like she had stumbled into something private, something that wasn't meant for her to see. But it wasn't the businessmen's silence that caught her attention. It was the look on their faces. There was something else there, something that for the first time made Lily feel like they were human. It lasted for only a few seconds before they were back to their usual selves, chatting away like nothing had happened. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But it made her think. Maybe there was more to these people than she realized. Maybe they weren't as untouchable as they seemed. But then again, that was a thought she quickly pushed aside. People like them didn't care about someone like her. They never had, and they probably never would. That evening, the cafe felt quieter than usual. The normal chatter and clinking of cups was replaced by a more subdued atmosphere. Lily couldn't quite figure it out. Was it just the time of day, or was something else going on? She glanced over at the corner table. The businessmen were gone, but they had left behind a strange, lingering energy. Something felt different, though Lily couldn't place what it was. As she cleared the tables and got ready to leave for the night, she caught sight of the piano in the corner of the cafe. It was old, a bit out of tune, and covered in dust, but to Lily it had always been a symbol of something she had left behind. The piano had been there for as long as she could remember, a relic of a past she no longer felt she could reach. But tonight, as she stood there, the idea of playing it crossed her mind, just for a moment. She shook her head. It was silly. She was a waitress, not a musician. It wasn't her life anymore. Music had faded from her world long ago, swallowed up by the reality of her daily struggles. But for a second, she thought about sitting down at that piano, feeling the cool keys under her fingers again. She imagined what it might feel like to just play, to lose herself in the music once more. But the moment passed quickly. She grabbed her bag, flicked off the lights, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool and crisp, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing by. Lily walked home with the same steady pace she always had, lost in her thoughts. But tonight her thoughts were different. For the first time in a long while, she couldn't stop thinking about that piano. The days blurred together for Lily. Each one felt like a repeat of the last: wake up, go to work, serve the regulars, clean the tables, and head home. There was nothing new, nothing exciting, just the same cycle that seemed to stretch on forever. But every so often, a small thing would shift in the routine, like a pebble falling into a calm pond, sending ripples that were barely noticeable but still there. And this particular day, it felt like the ripples were finally about to make a bigger splash. The cafe manager had announced, only that morning, that the cafe would be hosting a local charity dinner that evening. It wasn't something that happened often. Charity events were rare, and when they did happen, they always brought an air of excitement to the usually quiet space. The manager had even mentioned that there would be live entertainment, though Lily didn't pay much attention at the time. Live music was one of those things that felt like a distant dream to her, something for other people, not for someone like her. As the hours ticked by, the cafe slowly transformed. Extra tables were set up, the lighting was dimmed to create a cozy, intimate atmosphere, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. There was a buzz of activity as the staff moved around, preparing for the evening rush. The regulars had mostly disappeared by then, replaced by the volunteers and guests arriving for the event. It felt different, and Lily could sense the energy in the air. The usual hum of clinking cups and chattering customers was now replaced with an undercurrent of expectation. It was clear that tonight was special. Lily, as usual, kept to the edges of the action. She was assigned to the back, helping to bring out the plates of food as the event began. She moved quickly, her feet light on the floor, trying not to be in anyone's way. She had been part of so many events like this before. Always just a background figure, always invisible. She'd serve the meals, refill the drinks, and stay out of sight. It was her role, and she accepted it without complaint. It wasn't glamorous, but it was what she was good at. The evening began to unfold in the usual way. The chatter of guests mixed with the clink of silverware and the soft music playing in the background. Lily floated in and out of the room, delivering food and drinks, making sure everything was just right. But as the night wore on, something unexpected happened. The musicians who were supposed to perform hadn't shown up. The manager rushed around looking stressed, asking people if they knew anyone who could step in and perform. The guests were starting to notice, and the pressure was mounting. Lily was in the back when she overheard the manager talking to one of the other staff members. "Does anyone play an instrument?" he asked in a voice that was barely hiding his panic. There was a long silence, the kind that felt heavy, as no one spoke up. Everyone was busy, caught up in their own tasks, too focused on their work to think about the event. The manager sighed and paced back and forth. He was on the verge of giving up when, without really thinking, Lily found herself speaking up. "I can play," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She hadn't meant to say it. It had just slipped out, like a word she didn't know she was holding inside. The room fell silent for a moment, the words hanging in the air. The manager turned toward her, his eyes wide with surprise. "You can?" he asked almost incredulously. Lily nodded. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of excitement and fear bubbling up inside her. "I used to play the piano," she added, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She hadn't thought about playing in so long, had almost convinced herself that music wasn't part of her life anymore. But now, standing there, the memory of those old dreams came rushing back to her. So vivid it was as if she could already feel her fingers on the piano keys. The manager seemed unsure at first. He looked around the room nervously, then at the other staff members before turning back to her. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I mean, it's been a while, hasn't it?" Lily hesitated. Yes, it had been years, but the piano was still there, tucked in the corner, waiting. And maybe she didn't have the confidence she once had, but something about the situation, the music, the people, made her feel like she had no choice but to step up. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that this was her moment. If she didn't take it now, she might never get another chance, I'm sure, she said quietly, her voice gaining strength with each word. The manager nodded slowly, as if he was still trying to believe it, but he didn't argue. "All right then, let's give it a try." Lily made her way to the piano, her heart beating faster with each step. She hadn't touched a piano in years, hadn't even thought about it. She reached the instrument, running her fingers lightly over the dusty keys. It felt strange at first, the cool touch of the keys reminding her of a time when she was more carefree, more confident. Her hands shook slightly as she sat down, but she pushed through it. For a moment she just sat there, staring at the keys, unsure of what to play. The room was silent now, the chatter fading as the guests sensed that something was about to happen. The manager had stopped pacing and was watching her expectantly. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, and the weight of it almost made her want to stand up and walk away. But she couldn't run from this. Not when it felt like she was finally facing something that had been buried inside her for so long. Taking a deep breath, Lily pressed her fingers down on the keys slowly at first. The sound was tentative, a soft note that seemed almost too fragile to be real. She played a few more notes, her fingers remembering the familiar pattern, and with each sound she began to feel more grounded. The melody came back to her, flowing from her hands as if it had never left. The guests in the room started to listen, and Lily lost herself in the music. She forgot about everything, the cafe, the people, the pressure of the moment. It was just her and the piano, the notes carrying her into a world that felt real and alive. As she played, she could feel the room shift. The people who had been whispering to each other stopped talking. They were listening now, really listening. The businessman who had always ignored her, the ones who had never given her a second thought, were now leaning forward in their seats, captivated by the music. Some of them even exchanged glances, their surprise evident on their faces. It was as if they couldn't believe that this woman, the one they had always dismissed as just another waitress, was capable of something so beautiful, so powerful. Lily's fingers danced over the keys, the music flowing more easily now. She closed her eyes for a moment, lost in the rhythm and the sound of the piano. This was where she belonged. This was what she had been born to do. When the song ended, there was a long, stunned silence. Lily opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness of the room. She hadn't realized how many people were watching, how many had gathered around to listen. The cafe had fallen completely quiet, and for a moment, Lily felt as though time had stopped. Then the applause began. It wasn't loud at first, just a few hesitant claps. But it grew slowly. As the guests realized what they had just witnessed, Lily's heart raced, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and surprise. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything at all. The businessman from the corner table, the ones who had never looked her way, were now clapping too, their faces filled with astonishment. One of them even stood up and walked over to her, his expression softening in a way that made her feel like she was seeing him for the first time. "You were amazing," he said, his voice warm with genuine appreciation. "I had no idea you could play like that." Lily wasn't sure how to respond. She smiled nervously, her hand still trembling on the piano. She had just done something she hadn't even realized she was capable of. And now, for the first time in a long while, she felt seen. As the applause died down and the guests returned to their seats, the manager came over to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That was incredible," he said, still catching his breath. I never knew you had that in you." Lily could only nod, still trying to process what had just happened. She had just played in front of all those people who had never even looked at her twice. And somehow in that moment, she felt like she was finally being noticed, finally being seen for who she truly was. The night had left Lily feeling like she was floating in a strange new world. The applause, the attention, it was all so overwhelming. When the music stopped and the last note hung in the air, she could hardly believe it had really happened. For a few moments, as she sat there at the piano, the world outside seemed to fade away. But now, as she returned to reality, everything felt different. It felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and looked around at the people who had just moments ago treated her like she was invisible. The guests, the regulars, even the manager, all of them were now looking at her with a new kind of respect. Their eyes were softer, kinder, almost as if they were seeing her for the first time. One of the businessmen, the one who had been so dismissive of her before, approached her slowly, his steps hesitant. His usual arrogance seemed to have melted away, replaced by something else. Maybe it was awe, or maybe guilt. He smiled at her, though it was more genuine than any smile she had ever seen from him. "That was incredible," he said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't know you could play like that." Lily smiled back, though it felt a little forced. She nodded, but inside she wasn't sure how to react. Her mind was still racing, her heart still pounding from the performance. She had never expected this kind of reaction. She had never imagined that the people who had looked past her for so long would suddenly want to know more about her, to see her as someone more than just a waitress. "Thanks," she murmured, not sure what else to say. The words felt strange on her tongue, like they didn't quite fit her anymore. She had spent so long being quiet, staying in the background, that now, with all this attention, she didn't know how to handle it. The businessman didn't leave right away. He stayed there for a moment longer, watching her. It was as though he was trying to find the right words, to say something that would make up for all the times he had ignored her, all the times he had looked past her like she didn't matter. And maybe in that moment he realized that he had been wrong. I didn't realize," he said slowly. "You're not just a waitress." The words hung in the air, and Lily felt something inside her tighten. Not just a waitress. It was as if he was finally seeing her for who she was, or at least for something more than the job she did. But at the same time, there was a part of her that felt uncomfortable with the idea. She didn't want to be defined by this moment, by this performance. She didn't want to be the girl who could only be noticed when she played music. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the pressure building inside her. What if this was all they would ever see her as? What if now that they knew she could play the piano, that's all they would want from her? Music had been her dream, but it was also something she had kept hidden, something that had been buried under the weight of her responsibilities. She didn't want to be someone's entertainment, someone to be admired only for her talent. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft. "I didn't expect that." The businessman nodded, still watching her. "We never really know what people are capable of, do we?" he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Then, as if realizing the moment had passed, he gave her a small nod and turned back to his table. As Lily stood there, trying to catch her breath, she realized that the room had shifted in a way she hadn't expected. The once distant guests had gathered around, some of them asking questions, others offering praise. The cafe had become a strange mix of admiration and curiosity, and Lily couldn't decide if she was grateful or overwhelmed. The manager approached her, his face lighting up with excitement. "That was amazing," he said, clapping his hands together. "I didn't know you had it in you." Lily smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't know either," she replied honestly. The manager's enthusiasm didn't seem to notice her hesitation. "You really saved the night, Lily. I mean, I didn't know what we were going to do. You might have just found your new role around here." Lily's heart dropped at the thought. "I'm just a waitress," she said, almost as a reflex. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the compliment, but she felt uneasy with the sudden attention. It felt like people were starting to see her for something she wasn't sure she wanted to be seen as: a performer, a musician, someone who could be put on display for their enjoyment. The manager, however, seemed to take her words in a different way. "No, you're not just a waitress. You're someone who can make magic happen. Maybe there's more for you here, Lily. You could play for more events, maybe even get some paid gigs. Who knows what could come out of this?" Lily blinked, unsure of how to respond. The idea of being asked to perform regularly, to step into the spotlight like that, felt both exciting and terrifying. She had always kept her music to herself, a private part of her that no one knew about. But now it seemed like the whole world was ready to see her as something else, someone with potential, someone who could become more than she ever imagined. As the night wound down and the last guest began to leave, Lily found herself feeling conflicted. The applause, the praise, it all felt so surreal. It was like she had stepped into a world where she no longer fit. She had always been the invisible one, the quiet girl in the background, and now she was being thrust into a role she wasn't sure she was ready for. She walked to the back of the cafe, needing a moment alone to gather her thoughts. The quiet of the kitchen was a relief, a familiar comfort after the whirlwind of the evening. She leaned against the counter, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to make sense of everything. "Is this what I want?" she asked herself. "Is this the life I want, with people noticing me for my music, expecting me to be something I've buried for so long?" Her fingers tingled with the memory of the piano keys, the music still echoing in her mind. She had felt something when she played, something powerful that she hadn't felt in years. The music had been like a lifeline, pulling her out of the shadows and into a world where she could finally express herself. But now the question was, what next? What would happen if she embraced this new attention? Would it change her? Would it change the way people saw her? Or would she simply become the musician they wanted her to be? A version of herself she wasn't sure she recognized. As she stood there, lost in thought, the cafe slowly emptied out. The manager came by to thank her once more, his voice full of excitement. He mentioned a few more people who had enjoyed the performance and were asking about her availability for future events. Lily nodded, half listening, still trying to process everything. By the time she left the cafe that night, the streets were quiet, the lights of the city casting long shadows on the pavement. Lily walked home slowly, her mind racing with thoughts and questions she wasn't sure how to answer. She knew that something had shifted, that the world around her was changing in ways she hadn't expected. And while part of her was excited by the possibility of a new path, another part of her was scared of losing herself in the process, scared of becoming something she wasn't sure she wanted to be. As she walked, she found herself thinking about the piano again. The notes, the music, the way it had felt to play. She couldn't deny that it had felt good. It had felt like coming home, but the question still remained. Who was she really? The quiet waitress who kept to the background, or the musician who had the power to captivate a room with her talent? Only time would tell. The days after the charity dinner seemed to drag on for Lily, each one filled with a mix of excitement, doubt, and uncertainty. She had always thought that she knew exactly where her life was heading, even if that path was small and unnoticed. But now everything had changed. The applause, the praise, the sudden attention, it all felt like a whirlwind she hadn't seen coming. And for the first time, Lily found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to her life than what she had always known. The cafe had been quiet the next few days. The usual routine resumed, with Lily carrying trays, refilling coffee cups, and quietly doing her work. But she couldn't shake the memory of that night. The piano. The music. The way people had looked at her with respect and surprise. It wasn't just the performance that had stuck with her. It was the way it had made her feel. For the first time, she had felt seen. She had felt like she was more than just a background figure in other people's lives. In that moment, with her fingers dancing across the piano keys, she had felt like herself. But as the days passed, that feeling began to fade, and Lily found herself back in the quiet hum of the cafe unnoticed once again. The regulars came and went, their conversations unchanged, their eyes never lingering on her. It was like nothing had happened at all, and yet everything had changed. The manager had mentioned a few times how impressed he was by her performance, and how he hoped to have her play more often at future events. It had seemed like a good opportunity, a chance for Lily to step out from the shadows. But every time he brought it up, Lily hesitated. She wasn't sure what to do with the new attention. Part of her was flattered, of course, but another part of her felt uncomfortable, as if the world was suddenly expecting her to be someone she wasn't sure she wanted to be. It wasn't until one afternoon, when the cafe was quieter than usual, that Lily found herself thinking about it seriously. She was sitting at the counter, wiping down the last of the dishes, when the manager approached her once more. He smiled at her, his expression full of hope. "You know," he said, "I've been talking to some people who were at the charity event, and they're really interested in having you play again. Maybe even start performing regularly here. You could get paid for it, maybe even record something. There's a lot of potential here, Lily." Lily paused, her rag still in her hand. She stared at the manager, the weight of his words sinking in. There it was again, the possibility of something more. The opportunity she had never even allowed herself to dream about. But with it came the same fear. What if she wasn't good enough? What if this was all just a fluke? And more importantly, what if she didn't want this life? What if, in the end, it wasn't the life she had imagined for herself? "I don't know," she began slowly, feeling the words weigh heavily on her tongue. "I appreciate it, but I've been working here for so long. It's safe, you know? And I'm not sure if I'm ready to step out of that comfort zone." The manager's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "I get it," he said. "It's scary. But sometimes the scariest things lead to the best outcomes. You've got real talent, Lily, and you've been hiding it for so long. Maybe now's the time to see where it can take you." Lily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The words were kind, encouraging, but they also stirred something inside her, a fear that she wasn't ready to face. She had always told herself that her dreams didn't matter. She had told herself that she didn't deserve anything more than what she had. The cafe, the job, the small life she had built around it, that had been enough. Or at least she had convinced herself that it was. But as she stood there looking at the manager, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more out there for her. Maybe the music wasn't just something she did to pass the time. Maybe it was who she really was. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice quieter now, as if the decision were already starting to form inside her. The manager nodded, giving her a supportive smile. "Take your time," he said, "but just remember, sometimes the things we're most afraid of are the things that end up changing our lives." The rest of the day passed by in a blur, and that night after work, Lily found herself at home, sitting in her small living room, staring at the piano in the corner. The soft glow of the lamp in the room cast long shadows, and the quiet stillness of the night seemed to invite her into a moment of reflection. She ran her fingers over the keys, remembering the way they had felt under her hands, the way the music had come so naturally that night at the cafe. It had felt like she was finally living her truth, expressing something that had been locked inside her for so long. It had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been exhilarating. She had never imagined that something so small, something so simple, could have such a big impact on the world around her. But now, as she sat there, she wondered if it had been a one-time thing. Maybe it was just a fluke, a moment of courage that she would never be able to repeat. Or maybe it was the first step on a path she had been too afraid to walk before. Her mind kept returning to the same question. What do I really want? The truth was, she wasn't sure. But deep down, she knew that the life she had been living, the life of the invisible waitress who worked long hours without recognition, wasn't enough anymore. The music had shown her something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to believe was possible. She wasn't just a waitress, she was more than that. And if she didn't take this chance now, she might never get another one. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Lily made a decision. It wasn't easy and it wasn't without fear, but she knew that it was time to take a leap. It was time to let go of the small, safe world she had built and reach for something bigger, something that had always been just out of her grasp. The next day, she went to the cafe and found the manager, who was busy behind the counter. She hesitated for a moment, then walked up to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've made up my mind," she said quietly. "I want to give it a try. I want to perform. I want to see where this music can take me." The manager's face lit up with excitement and he clapped his hands together. "That's great. I knew you'd make the right choice." Lily smiled, feeling a rush of relief and excitement. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally taking control of her life. She was ready to stop hiding, ready to show the world who she really was. From that day on, Lily began performing at the cafe more regularly. The manager booked her for events, and soon word began to spread. People who had never taken the time to notice her now sought her out to hear her play. A local music producer who had heard her perform at one of the events reached out to her, offering her the chance to record an album. The opportunity felt both surreal and thrilling. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she had made the right choice. But with each note she played, with each performance she gave, Lily's confidence grew. The once invisible waitress had become a woman who was finally chasing her dreams, stepping into a future she had always imagined but never thought she could reach. The day Lily left the cafe to pursue music full-time, she stood at the door for a moment, looking back at the familiar space. It had been her world for so long, a world that had shaped her into the person she was. But now it was time to step into a new chapter. And as she walked away, her heart filled with hope, knowing that she had finally found her true path.